Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome to our Middle East. I'm Dan Diker. Al-Sharq al-Awsat lana man. Together, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Druze, you name it, we've got it in the Middle East, and it's a complex, colorful region full of complications, full of security challenges. But the question today is what's really going on behind the American-driven Saudi-Israel Normalization Pact. A lot of chaos and mayhem, or is it security shield for the Middle East? Join us. I'm very honored today to welcome a guest, a friend, a colleague, Irina Tsukerman, a Middle East analyst with the Arabian Peninsula Institute. She is joining us from the United States. Irina Tsukerman, great to have you with us on the program. Thanks for joining us. A lot of very serious security talk we have to discuss today because, as you said in our conversations offline during the last few months, there is in contradistinction to the political talk going on about normalization between the U.S.-driven Saudi-Israel normalization deal, is security mayhem and a lot of quiet cooperation between Israel and the Saudis. Is it not?
Well, let's start with the fact that the actual normalization is not happening. For one thing, we have not seen any direct talks between Israelis and Saudis, which are instrumental to any sort of a real major political deal. We have seen with the Abraham Accords that the Emiratis, Bahrainis, and Israelis had talked extensively for well over a year, if not more, prior to signing off on an agreement. This is just not happening with Saudi Arabia. And the reason for that, there are many reasons for that. The Iran normalization is a part of it, certainly, but there's also the lack of political will inside Saudi Arabia itself, starting with the fact that the tribal makeup of the country is such that there is no support for formal normalization with Israel, and tribes play such an important part in the country's political system that at times they can in fact challenge even the throne in its foreign policy, and this is one of those examples where for sure there is a great deal of social opposition.
The important point here, though, is from a security standpoint, there is no opposition from the tribes, nor is there from the royal court to a deepened security cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia with regard to the Iranian regime, which the Saudis have sort of re-engaged with diplomatically, but nonetheless, there is a deepening security cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Yes, in fact, Saudi Arabia benefits greatly from this sort of cooperation, as long as it's tactical and behind the scenes. Nobody seems to mind. About 50% of cybersecurity software in Saudi Arabia originates with Israel, and of course, there's all sorts of tactical cooperation on Syria and many other local regional security issues. That said, I would be very careful to engage in full-on optimism on this issue, because at any moment things can change. And Saudi Arabia's normalization with Iran is a primary challenge, though not the only one. The growing closeness to China and Russia are also a potential test of this relationship. Namely the surveillance technologies and other forms of regional cooperation.
It seems, Irina, that if you weigh the political benefits of possible Saudi-Israeli normalization, which is really being drummed up and trumpeted by the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, versus the real critical security sense right now and the major threats to the world order coming out of the Iranian regime's metastasizing destabilization across the Middle East, including, by the way, it's taking over of the Syrian chemical weapons program, which President Obama had sort of succumbed to temptations by the Russians who have taken it over. But it seems right now that Iran, at the same time that it's bear hugging for its own purposes Saudi Arabia and the Saudi, let's call it the Saudi alliance of the UAE and Bahrain for the purposes of this conversation, there are many lurking dangers that are taking place behind the political mask of normalization.
I would say that normalization, or talk of normalization at least, is a diversion from all the regional security obstacles and challenges facing these countries. And Syria is one of those four places where Saudi Arabia has been a consistent partner to the United States on various operations, but very, very unlikely to challenge Iran's incremental and growing not only presence, which is quite entrenched, but takeover of major programs such as that chemical weapons production, and which is a threat to the entire region. And one of the major concerns is Assad's normalization into the Arab League and Russia brokered direct bilateral talks between Saudis and Assad. If Saudi Arabia is to normalize bilateral relations to that extent, it's very unlikely to engage in challenging these weapons-related developments alongside Israel. So Israel is losing potentially valuable allies in the region as a result of Iran and Syria normalization with the Arab Gulf states.
And the political and security collision seems to be growing closer and closer and closer, because here you have, on the one hand, the Iranian foreign minister has shown up in Saudi Arabia. That is Iran's political warfare move by bear hugging Saudi and making the political relationship seem as normalized as possible. And on the other hand, the Iranian regime has not stopped for a minute its actions across the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, Iraq. And so it looks like it's a head fake, to use a sports analogy, in U.S. terms, where Iran is basically has its cake and is eating it at the same time, because it hasn't really given up anything, perhaps, but a momentary respite in Yemen with the Houthis. At the same time, it continues to subvert the major countries across the Middle East, which Jordan's leader, King Abdullah II had called the Shiite Crescent back in 2004, and that crescent has become bloodier and bloodier as we move forward.
I actually would address the Houthi issue as much more serious than people give it, as what people consider it to be, because they have actually not stopped the attacks inside Yemen, and Yemen is a gateway to Saudi Arabia, and I would not be surprised if both Yemeni Houthis and Iraqi Shia militias hadn't at least had not been testing or exploring border security with the Saudis. Saudi Arabia also hosts a very significant Shia population, which has often been challenged by Iran's meddling and interference. And this is right now is as good a time as any for Iran to continue making inroads inside Saudi Arabia, which could be particularly detrimental to these concerns.
And you have widespread reports of both Iranian and Saudi economic cooperation, commercial exchange, at even aspects of technology exchange. All of the deepening political, diplomatic, and economic relationship that can actually create a lot more dangers on the security front, because of when you have, on the face of it, deepening political ties and deepening commercial civil society ties that look like real normalization. while on the other hand you have Iranian regime subterfuge, destabilization, and subversion continuing apace. You're looking at a very poisonous mixture of this political and security, these security elements.
The landscape here, the security landscape, is very complex because Iran and Saudis have their own share of challenges as well, such as the ongoing dispute along with Kuwait over a shared gas field. So this economic cooperation has its limits, and they're not that easy to bypass because both sides are entrenched with their territorial claims over that gas field. However, there is also a real incentive to maximize the financial benefits of this relationship, at least while it's still possible to do so. And Saudis are usually extraordinarily slow in any sort of diplomatic developments, but we have seen almost a rush into this embrace of Iran from the moment normalization with Iran was announced. We have seen this rush to discuss the opening of embassies, high-level visits. The king was invited to Iran. I don't think he will go, but the foreign minister has already gone. And we are seeing this attempted this rhetorical elevation of Saudi Arabia on such days as the infamous Al-Quds Day by Iran, where previously Saudi Arabia was consistently attacked rhetorically by Iranian officials. So there is a legitimate effort not to put aside the deep-seated issues which are not going anywhere, but to create the appearance of a very close cooperation. And this is not only because Iranians see this as commercially beneficial to them, which they certainly do. Years of sanctions and instability has left, and mismanagement of their own issues has left them wanting for money, but it is also a blow to Western interests in the region, this appearance of closeness on issues that are not merely financial and economic, but also political.
That's a very important point you've made here, because when we say that the Saudi Iranian regime re-engagement, or the appearance of a re-engagement with the through the good offices of China, completely opposes and in fact uproots America's, the United States' critical national security interest in the region. So what they seem to have done here is to think that if they bring Israel into the equation and try to solve the Palestinian issue through the offices of Saudi Arabia, they can create what they think is a integrated, peaceful, stable, secure Middle East. But I would suggest that it is creating exactly the opposite, because it is pulling the Saudis and the Israelis in a direction that perhaps neither of them really want to go right now, even though everyone certainly in Israel is talking about normalization, the prayer for normalization, the greatest thing that could happen is normalization. But at the end of the day, in Israel's intelligence basement, and where all the serious discussions are happening, they realize that they need the Saudis more than ever in a quiet, security-driven conversation, not in a public political normalization.
I would say that the impetus for public diplomatic rapprochement was initially was actually struck down even before the Biden administration. But when it became patently obvious that Biden was going to be coming in, and that is the Al-Ula agreement, which reintegrated the GCC states, which had been in a state of crisis since 2017, bringing Qatar back and Oman back to the fold. And that Qatar has been basically a cutout for Iran on many issues. So we need to see these events as not disconnected. The return of Qatar, which is essentially a pro-Muslim Brotherhood state, has emboldened Islamists, the old guard, and asserted conservative factions in Saudi Arabia, and made any sort of political high-level engagement with Israel much less likely. Don't get me wrong, on the surface, the signs appear to be there. You've had Jared Kushner and various American alleged architects of Abraham Accords visiting and talking about Israel in public at public fora in Saudi Arabia. But if you look at the media and the media reports in Arabic, any mention of positive deepening of political relations with Israel has disappeared from the public discourse, which was exactly the opposite before the Ula agreement, where such rhetoric was ramping up inside the country just as much as outside, with the effort by the rulers to sell this idea and to test it with the public and to kind of start re-engaging the public towards that particular commitment, knowing full well that the position socially was quite strong. Now there is no effort to argue this case at all. It's disappearing. It's becoming significantly less popular inside the country. It's basically banished from official talk.
But it's interesting when you use the Q word, which is Qatar, and Syria, both one in the GCC and the Arab League. These two countries really represent the opposite of what Saudi Arabia is looking for in terms of its own regional security architecture, right? So in a way, this bear hug and all the talk of regional normalization integration when it comes to Syria and Qatar is really working against the Saudis.
Indeed, Qatar, despite the normalization with Saudi Arabia, continues attacks on Saudi enterprises directly and indirectly. Globally, we can see constant campaigns against Saudi investment into sports as just one innocuous example. Security concerns are far more serious. Essentially, Qataris are now very firmly engaged with the old guard faction inside Saudi Arabia, which has been consistently opposed to Vision 2030 reforms, both social reforms domestically and foreign policy outreach to Israel and the West. All of these interests are very much more comfortable with authoritarian Russia and China and even Iran than with the United States or Israel. And that dynamic behind the scenes is very much coloring the political developments we are now seeing, which is why the Biden effort to portray this normalization with Israel as a real possibility at the current juncture is just a fantasy, and unhelpful one that disguises many other political issues in the region, including between Saudi Arabia and other states that threaten its own interests. Qatar continues challenging Saudi Arabia domestically, not just regionally as an actor, and it is very close to Iran, and it is using that relationship to, on the one hand, make financial gains as a result of normalization, but on the other hand, make inroads that will devastate Saudi Arabia as a nation state.
What is in your view, the major inroad that could devastate Saudi Arabia when it comes to Qatar? I just will mention it is interesting in the context of this discussion that Saudi has offered billions and billions of dollars to become the leading sports host and figure in the Middle East, wanting to take that role away from Qatar.
Yes, that competition is ongoing. It's dynamic, but these two states are not the only ones competing directly. Bahrain and UAE especially have been part of that sports competition landscape for a long time. But getting back to this aspect, religion is the primary tool that Qatar uses. Political rhetoric are all fine and livable, but the fact that it uses religion to manipulate the minds and to try to undermine Saudi Arabia in the region by way of undermining its authority as a custodian of the two holy sites is incredibly dangerous. And the Israel part, and not even just Israel, but even any presence of traveling Jewish continues to Saudi Arabia has become that point that Qatar uses very effectively through the media, through rhetoric, through the mosques, to undermine Saudi authority. And that's exactly what Iran is looking for, to take over the primacy and the control of the two holy sites. And the more the Saudi royal family is seen as being undermined and weakened and smeared by these religious campaigns, pro-Muslim Brotherhood campaigns, that equate any sort of discussion with Israel to desecration of the two polar sides, the more Iran benefits as a result, and the more Iran can expand its own regional religious influence, exporting Islamic revolution as it has been doing for the past 40 years, and that's at the heart of Iran's political strategy, that religious exportation of the Islamic revolution.
Absolutely. And then let's bring in two complicating factors, one called Russia and the other called China. Both have become real public adversaries of the United States and complicating factors in this whole calculus that we've been discussing today. Let's start first with Russia. Russia has a primary presence, as it has for a number of years in Syria. And how has the Iranian moves in Syria affected Russia's own sense of the importance of its security presence and control, really, over much of Syria's airspace?
At one point, Russia has been trying to use its own presence in Syria as a way of essentially maneuvering Israel into its own camp vis-a-vis Iran and Iran-related security issues by claiming that it quote-unquote allows Israel to attack Iranian sites. That has become an excuse for many of the Israeli security personnel to take a stand away from actively attacking Russia in any way, or even assisting with weapons-related exports to Ukraine. In reality, the situation has always been far more complex than that. It is true that the Obama administration strengthened and entrenched Russian presence to Syria, but Russia and Iran have not always seen eye to eye there, and Russia has not always been consistently strong in Syria. Israel has been able to take its own security measures against Iran without Russia's involvement before Russia appeared there. And once the Ukraine war started, Russia's positions in Syria militarily have been significantly weakened. However, what happened is that Russia, by playing a diplomatic role in trying to normalize Assad with the Arab League, with the Saudis, with Turkey, it has returned to a position of diplomatic primacy, and along with other factors, it has been able to play its regional cards quite well. It is still not the all-powerful actor in Syria it claims to be militarily, which is why I think this its efforts to latch on to Iran are kind of a little bit superficial. Iran's growing presence is a real concern. Russia militarily has been quite weak, and we've seen an example of that when the U.S. forces confronted the Wagner militias at one point, wiping out 300 fighters in one incident, and the rest of the Russian military there is no better, as we have seen from the Ukraine example. But in terms of political influence, it is going to be quite substantial, and Russia is fully taking advantage of the various regional miscommunications and lack of consistent strategy and Iran-driven divisions that we are seeing. And there was once talk of an Arab NATO that would join Israel to integrate its defense measures and to defy Iran. It has always been fraught with controversy due to the different positions on the issue by Qatar and others, but now it has been exacerbated by Russia's involvement and attempt to become the primary political broker in the region.
But clearly, the Russia's deep involvement in Ukraine has taken most of its resources and most of its really strategic assets and really focused them there. I mean, I think we see in the last 2 years a major shift in Russian thinking, in Russian strategy, where they saw their presence in Syria as being a bedrock, an anchor of their interests in the region, and they could enforce that. Now it seems that, certainly in terms of military spending and in terms of the focus and in terms of information operations, that they really have to focus 90% of their efforts on the Ukraine.
Indeed, and this would be a very good opportunity for Israel to weaken Russia as much as possible, because Russia is not really being helpful in Syria. In fact, it's creating artificial obstacles to fully engaging against Iranian positions, and we have seen the return of Hezbollah. Russia has not done anything to stop it. On the contrary, it has been cooperating with pro-Iran interests there. So the more is done to drive Russia out of Syria and to weaken it on every level, and to challenge it on its various attempted fronts around the world, the better for Israel's security. It's not politically; it's still trying to be a winner in this political situation by latching on to the GCC offense at the U.S. foreign policy. But this is a very tactical engagement. It's not in anyone's long-term interest, and Russia as a state has very little to offer. It appeals mostly to greed of specific officials and government level interests. There are some members of royal families who are heavily invested in Russia's energy sector and so forth. But on a strategic level, Russia has nothing to offer. It has enabled all the worst threats in the region. It has actively cooperated with Houthis in the past, and it's growing closer to Iran, which is certainly not in any of the Arab states' interests, except for maybe Qatar, which has an even closer relation with Russia going back decades.
Absolutely. And then enter China, which is a wild card here, because on the one hand, we don't see Chinese forces, not Air Force or Navy or Special Forces or Ground Forces on the ground in the region, unless there are developments that you can tell us about in terms of Chinese military that we don't know about. On the other hand, China has become sort of the military financier, weapons supplier, a mediator, a complicating factor to what already is an impossibly complex situation.
Well, China has talked about building a military base in Syria, and as far as I see, China's military ambitions as a direct military power broker are expanding. And we can talk about the Chinese military presence in Iran for various reasons, including potentially training, but its biggest export has been surveillance technology, both to Iran and to Saudi Arabia, which has again been used for all sorts of purposes by the worst possible people. We are again talking about the old guard and their interests in suppressing dissent internally, and we're talking about Iran's use of surveillance tech both against its own citizens and as a regional threat to Israel and to others. The convergence of this trilateral relationship is nothing positive, because it's not bringing together any reformists or any diverse ethnic interests. It's bringing together the worst groups in each country: the regime in Iran and the old guard and the Islamist factions in Saudi Arabia, and all of them are hostile to Israel. They're not just they're happy to take what they can in Saudi Arabia for the time being. But if they ever see a legitimate alternative, if China ever becomes stronger enough to compete with Israel on technology and on its military security backing, to be sure Israel is going to be dropped.
Irina, as we have this conversation, and what we've done here in the last 30 minutes or so is to paint a picture or a tapestry of the deep security chaos developing and deepening, intensifying across the Middle East. It seems from a political standpoint, you can argue that the riskiest development would be Israeli-Saudi normalization. It would actually be, you could argue that the best option right now would be to continue a quiet, under-the-radar working relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia in view of Chinese infiltration, in view of Russian intervention, in view of the metastasis of Iranian subversion. It seems that when you add all of these elements up, Israel needs secret relationships, quiet partnerships on a security and military level. And the last thing it needs right now is public, diplomatic, international, ceremonial normalization with Saudi Arabia, which would end up limiting what it's able to do because of the public color, the public perception, and the public profile of what that relationship could be.
That normalization is logistically and practically impossible. The demand for a full return to the Arab Peace Initiative, which required the creation of the Palestinian state, is just not going to happen at the time being, for factors involving not just Israel itself, but the Palestinians just as much as Israel. And on the other hand, Saudi demands of the United States for the civilian nuclear program and for the full defense treaty as a directly tied to the normalization have been already dismissed by President Biden. So this continuing discussion about a possible deal is not only a fantasy, but a fabrication. It is literally a fabrication because all sides are fully aware that none of these essential factors demanded of each other can be met at this point in time. So the practical normalization can't happen, but yes, this continuing obsession with the optics are dangerous. They're distracting. They're diversion from dealing with the serious issues that the administration has essentially greenlit. This Iranian strengthening in Syria is something that the administration is willing to tolerate, just like the Obama administration was willing to tolerate the horrific civil war in Syria as a precondition for a nuclear deal with Iran. We're seeing the same single-minded fixation on procuring some sort of a deal, not even the full JCPOA, by any sort of deal with Iran at the expense of all other security interests in the region. And hence some of this talk about this normalization to keep the public distracted from what's really going on, which is Iran making inroads absolutely everywhere, being closer than ever to producing a nuclear weapon, while the U.S. has given up its chemical weapons capability completely and is left vulnerable by the trilateral alliance of Russia, China, and Iran, as well as various proxies and movements, extremist movements operating in the region.
So in short, would you say that the CIA and National Security Council in the United States, they're fundamentally missing a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of security interest among players in the Middle East? Because it seems that by as you put it very well, this singular obsession with scoring an Israeli-Palestinian deal, with trying to mediate Saudi normalization, the enormous price it would cost the United States in blood and treasure over time, because you can see all of these different security elements that we've talked about unraveling very quickly and coming to, a 3, 4, 5 front war: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, United States, NATO, Qatar. I mean, you can see everyone pulling towards his own direction to what would ultimately be called, a political and kinetic nuclear explosion.
I'm not sure whether the U.S. intelligence apparatus is equipped to deal with the complexities of the region, because, quite frankly, the history of U.S. involvement in the region showed no understanding of these internal regional dynamics, tribal dynamics, and their relationships to the state, and various diverse ethnic and religious interests within each country. We have seen that U.S. foreign policy has consistently focused on finding the one voice, whatever that happened to be at any point in time, and putting all eggs in that one basket, no matter what it was. And we're seeing the same mistake being done with Iran today, focusing single-handedly on the Iran and whatever we claim of its opposition, ignoring that it's an extremely diverse and complicated country. We're seeing the same with Saudi Arabia, where the U.S. is not forget the tribal politics. Even within Riyadh, U.S. is incapable of addressing who has the real power and who has been sidelined, and much less which of the groups in question are would meet the real security interests of the United States more. Actually, U.S. prefers to deal with the more extreme, hardline, old guard factions precisely because of the long-standing relationships with the intelligence community and with other interests in Washington, and to the detriment of the overall security picture. There are many examples of that. Unfortunately, the very same people who were key intelligence interlocutors with the United States in the past were also the ones closely tied to the 9/11 attacks, unfortunately. So you have seen that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't know whether it's really an issue of complete ignorance, but we do know that there is an issue of political blindness to all these elements. Also, political blindness, arrogance, ineptitude, and complete disregard for reality, which has colored multiple U.S. administrations now for decades at a time. And unfortunately, until that changes, we will not see any significant improvement.
Yeah, and I think in short, just to put an exclamation point on your very eloquent and bottom line assessment, we should say normalization, dir balak. Warnings to everyone, or as they say in Russian, niet. Normalization, niet, and tribal and ethnic intelligence, da. Yes, absolutely. We all need to know it. I think you helped us open our eyes to the deep complexities of tribal and ethnic intrigue and collision and individual interests in the Middle East. And that's what we try to do on Our Middle East here in the program from Jerusalem. Irina Tsukerman, it's been a great pleasure having you. You've informed us and given us much to think about, and we really look forward to having you again very soon, taking into account all the hard work you're doing at the Arabian Peninsula Institute. I hope you'll give us a little more time when we continue to talk about these complexities in our Middle East. Irina, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.